multiple modalities of transport. What we will frequently do is in combined accidents where there are a number of people is if you have a number of ambulances that will be used, you can be using helicopters and ambulances, but these people may be taken to different trauma centers so you don't overuse the facilities that you have. Just all are ways of maximizing care that we have found will increase the number of patients that will survive.
I have a few comments about that. First, we don't have any helicopter in Paris flying during the night because it's not allowed by the police and the regulation of air to fly overnight. Second, I've read, I'm not sure if it's true or not, because once again I wasn't there anymore, but I've read that she had a cardiac arrest just few seconds after she was taken away off the car. So of course having at least two large IV access and getting her intubated and treating the cardiac arrest, that takes some time. Plus a general comment, as you said, it's very easy after you know the exact diagnosis, and I'm not sure actually that we know exactly the all injuries she had. I think she had brain injuries. We know that she had this pulmonary vein injuries, but maybe she had something else. We don't really know that because it hasn't been released. But it's always very easy, while as soon as you know the exact diagnosis, to say that's very easy, you should have done that and that, and like this book saying that if you have a pulmonary vein torn, you just have to go to a chest surgery. You saw this pulmonary vein, and after that everything is okay. That's too simple to be true. Of course, both of us, we know that it's not that easy. You have to find where the bleeding is coming from, and you have to somewhat prepare your patient, and you have to treat the other injuries too. So it's always easy in a statistic way to say that we could say something, we could have done something quicker, but in the particular situation, I guess they had a lot of difficulties to bring her alive to the hospital.
Okay, I'm wondering, in the interest of time, Dr. Ratson in Washington, do you have some final comments that you would like to make?
I will be brief, but I think that both Dr. Meyer and Dr. Levy have said very, very interesting pieces that really do shed light on how we communicate these difficulties to the public. What I found interesting is just 2 days ago in the Washington Post, we have an update on the crash inquiry. And it now says that she did not arrive at the hospital until 3.5 hours after the accident. And it goes on to sort of quote unnamed American experts who's in the new book that's come out that, again, might have saved, and mentioning part of the hope and almost wanting to sort of point to, oh, the problem was in the post-trauma care, being everything from the time of the accident to, of course, she was pronounced dead. I think that's where a lot of this has been focusing. I think Dr. Levy had suggested is that we have tried in the state systems approach treating these when we have, unfortunately, high numbers of people who are traumatized on a frequent basis. This has continued in a way that we've been able to systematize to sort of have the best approach. And what I think is frustrating, and not only what's been happening here in the press, but I think the discussions on the media news and so forth, is that it's focused on, did the system go awry? We've heard that 3 miles or 5 kilometers or whatever the distance, it doesn't matter if you had helicopters or you were able to do whatever, that the amount of time and the system of having somebody be treated by a physician at the scene of the accident rather than transported to the hospital is just a system that has a major flaw in it, and it's unfortunate that it happened in this highly publicized case. I I think it's always good in retrospect to look back, and I think Dr. Mayer is right by saying once we have the diagnosis now, we could have chose 6 or whatever number of ways of treatment. I don't think that's the issue. I think we hope now to look back and say what could have been done better, not only at the scene, but also in the great respect for the family, which I think Dr. Mayer was very honest and appreciates saying of how he was attempting to give the medical sequence in his memory, but realized that news nowadays has become more commerce rather than caring about individuals and families. And I think that's a major issue that's probably an underlying theme of the conference there, and it's unfortunate I haven't been able to hear all of it, but this is very interesting, and I think you're doing a fine service to look at this a year after, and hopeful that something like this, of course, wouldn't happen again.
I'd like to thank Dr. Levy as well as Dr. Ratson for participating, and we will talk to you when we get back to the United States.
Thank you.
And also thank Dr. Baez for some insights. I'm sure that many of you will want to talk to him a bit later. We also have our next panelist. We're very excited to have Lady Colin Campbell, so if we could ask her to please come up. Thank you, Dr. Baez. I think one of the exciting things about having Lady Colin Campbell here, especially talking to her now, is that she would very much like to entertain notions of interaction with the audience. Some of you I know are familiar with her books and her works. But initially what we would like to do is maybe just have her talk a bit about some of her background as a writer, some of the themes that she thinks is quite pervasive in her work. And with that, welcome.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Which one? This? Yes. A bit further back here. Well, I actually came to write about the Princess of Wales by accident. If you'd asked me 8 years ago what my idea of living hell would have been, it would have been to write anything on the royal family. I mean, 8 years ago, people just didn't write about, well, my sort of person didn't write about the royal family. And certainly the royal family didn't speak about the royal family, nor did the royal family leak about the royal family. Of course, an awful lot has changed in the last few years. And I'll come right to the bottom line and say the Princess of Wales changed most of it. Diana was a very interesting woman because she was absolutely, in some ways, very much what people think she was like, and she was also the absolute opposite of what people thought she was like. She was not and had never been a sweet, shy, lily-livered little creature who wouldn't say boo to a goose. A goose wouldn't have dared to say boo to her. She was extremely strong-willed, and she always, even as a little girl, had her own agenda and knew how to put it into operation. Now, I'm not saying any of this as a put-down, because I actually admire someone who is perspicacious and who knows what they want and who goes about getting what they want, hopefully in a nice way. Anyway, I used to do an awful lot of fundraising for charity. And in 1990, Britain was having a pretty serious recession. And in those days, it was very, very difficult to raise money for charity. As those of you who are French, when Princess Marta Lubomirska said to me, she said at a Red Cross meeting, she said, all of my rich friends have no money anymore. And it really was absolutely true. I mean, people who 5 years before would have dropped £5,000 without thinking, half the time didn't want to spend £150. And this was a really big problem for people who were raising money for various charities, because for obvious reasons, charities need the public to survive. So I, who was quite experienced and rather cynical by this stage about fundraising, because I used to say, well, you know, we've got to get bums on the seat, and basically most people want all of the glory, but basically they really want good value for money, which is true. Most people may spontaneously once or twice give from the heart, but the people who really support charities, if you're a fundraiser, you realize, are doing it for social kudos, business reasons, blah, blah, blah. There are 1,000 reasons, most of which have nothing to do with altruism. So I came up with the idea of doing a book on Diana as a fundraiser for 3 of her charities, which were 3 of my charities. Now, some of you might know that I'm sort of connected to the royal family through marriage. So my path over the years, even before my marriage actually, has crossed with many of the royals. So I knew that the way to go about this was to approach Diana unofficially, because this is the way it's done in royal circles. You approach the royal unofficially. If you get a green light, then you make an official approach, which is what I did. And Diana liked the idea. It was basically, I would do a biography of her, focusing on her charity work, with a little bit about the marriage. Now, I knew pretty much most of the dirt on the marriage. I knew the marriage was over. I knew that Diana had had several lovers. I knew that Charles was wrapped up with Camilla. I mean, everyone in our sort of circle knew it. It was an open secret, which, of course, at the time, the general public didn't know. I certainly had no intention of writing about any of this, because in those days, one simply didn't write about things like that. And certainly, if you occupied anything approaching a reasonable social position, you were not going to dish the dirt on the royals because they dump you. I mean, you only need to think of, say, the Queen and Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, when Crawfie, who was the girl's governess, wrote an absolutely wonderful panegyric about the royal family. Despite the fact that the Queen and Princess Margaret had adored Crawfie, they never ever spoke to her again till she died. And I certainly wasn't going to position myself so that I would be ostracized. So, anyway, Diana liked the idea. And so I made my official approach to her private secretary, wrote my letter. I was told to come into the palace, which I did. And in this month between the arrangement, or 3 weeks, whatever it was, arrangement being made for me to go into the palace and going into the palace to set up things, things started to unravel. And why they really started to unravel was that Diana had taken it into her head that she wanted out of the marriage, and she thought this was an absolutely God-given opportunity to get out of the marriage. She had been trying since 1987 to leave. She had packed her suitcases on several occasions. On one occasion, Penny Thornton, who was her astrologer, and who incidentally had been a flatmate of mine before my marriage, had been rung up by the Prince of Wales to please stop Diana from leaving. This was in 1987. And so Diana was pretty desperate, and she tried everything to get out because she thought, well, she was young and she didn't see why she had to stay in a marriage that was, well, no, I should rephrase that. She didn't see why she had to stay in a way of life that was incompatible to her desires and her happiness when the marriage was over. That's a more accurate way of putting it. And anyway, so when my book the idea was floated, she decided that this was a great opportunity because I was what they call in royal circles a safe pair of hands, which meant I wouldn't be knifing the royals or knifing her, as she thought. Well, I was absolutely astonished when she changed tack on me like this, because she didn't tell me she was changing tack, she just changed it. And she assumed that I would go along with it, which I must say she was right about, because after thinking about it, I decided what the heck I would go along with it. And we set up the book. My agent set up a book deal, which would be an unauthorized biography. And we started work on it, and we saw each other and spoke a lot on the phone, because it was very awkward to see each other. Because at the time I lived in the Cundy Street flats, which are owned by the Duke of Westminster on the Grosvenor estate, and they are the largest concentration of aristocrats and members of the royal household in the whole of the country. And for instance, Diana's great aunt, the Duchess of Abercorn, lived in the Cundy Street flats. So did the Van Cutsons, who are Charles's great friends and who lived directly above me, and who Diana regarded as some of her greatest enemies. So she obviously couldn't come to me. I equally couldn't pitch up at Kensington Palace, you know, tape recorder in hand or whatever, because we couldn't give the game away, so to speak. So anyway, we had to resort to a certain amount of subterfuge. And Diana also loved the telephone. She was a great one for sitting on a phone. And so I set up the book deal and started the book. And then it came to the bit about her marriage and about Camilla Parker Bowles. And I knew that Diana had great fears about the loss of custody of her children. And it was my considered opinion that a lot of her fears were exaggerated. I could understand where she was coming from, because she was really terrified that history was going to repeat itself, and that what had happened to her mother would happen to her. And you couldn't explain this to her, because she said that she was not prepared to take the chance. Even if it was an outside chance, she couldn't take it. Which equally, I mean, if you have children, you have to understand that as well. However, it put me in a very difficult position, because I was not going to trash the Prince of Wales unfairly. Not because I particularly, by this point, really cared. I actually thought I cared about the royal family, because I actually thought they would ostracize me, which thank God they haven't done. But anyway, at the time it seemed like a distinct possibility. But I thought, just on moral grounds, you don't trash someone who you know is going to be unfairly trashed. It's just not a decent thing to do. And while she was doing it for personal reasons, I don't think it made I don't think it would have been right for me because I had nothing to lose. I didn't have custody of the children to lose. So we really fell out over that because I said to her I was very sorry, but I was not going to be trashing Charles. I knew that Diana was egging the pudding severely when she said that Charles and Camilla had been lovers in the early days of the marriage. I knew this was not true. I knew this from many people, including cousins of Diana's, one of whom lived very near to Camilla Parker Bowles and could see the comings and goings of the cars. I knew that Diana was the one who had the first lover. I knew that Diana had had several lovers, that contrary to her, the position she was trying to adopt with me and subsequently adopted with Andrew Morton, which was that she had actually outdone the Virgin Mary because she'd given the Virgin birth twice, while dear Mary had only managed it once. I knew that this was, you know, self-serving, to say the least. Now, I wasn't knocking her for protecting her interests, but I certainly was not going to be a participant in, I was not going to be Goebbels to her Hitler, let's put it that way. And we fell out in a major way over this. And I then was presented with the fact I had a book contract, and I had decided this was a wonderful opportunity for me to make money of my own and to be free of having my hand out to my family. And I wanted to adopt a baby, and I thought, great, baby money, and I'm going to continue with it. So I did, and that's how Diana in Private came to be written. Well, of course, Diana was spitting mad that I had mentioned only 4 of her lovers. But at the time that the book was written, which was 1991, the world would have absolutely lynched me. I mean, I nearly got lynched for saying that she had 4 lovers. If I'd actually told the truth about the number of lovers she'd had, you know, I'm sure I wouldn't be here today. And so she was furious about that because she thought, well, first of all, she comes from an old courtier background, which is do whatever you please, but always deny it. And everyone can sleep with anyone that they want, but under no circumstances should they ever admit to being anything but faithful to their one husband. Even if they've been married 6 times, they've been faithful to one husband. And, you know, that's the old courtier game. And, which is fine. I mean, I'm not condemning it. I certainly don't play by those rules, as anyone who's read my autobiography can see. Because I was rather more forthcoming about my lovers than Diana was about hers. But anyway, she was really angry with me over that, not only because she felt I'd sullied her pristine reputation, but also because she was still not separated. And she was always in the back of her mind was the courtiers, and the courtiers rarely translated to her brother-in-law Robert Fellows, who she absolutely loathed with a passion, that they would deprive her of her children. And so anything at all that she didn't like fell under this umbrella, which of course gave her tremendous power, because if you're fighting for your children, I mean, you're gonna absolutely tear people to bits if they even say that you glanced at a strange man, much less slept with several. And Diana mounted a very efficient campaign to negate the effects of the book. The book was being serialized in March 1992, and the day that Diana knew that the lovers part was coming out, she got in touch with Andrew Morton and told him that the Duke and Duchess of York were going to be separated, so that she would knock the serialization of the front pages of the World's Gutter Press with a hotter story, which she succeeded in doing. Of course, she did it a little bit late because on day one went the thing about her lovers. And those of you who are American and who lived in New York might remember the New York Post, the King and I, not the King and I, which was Cindy Adams' thing on this front page of the New York Post about King Juan Carlos and Diana. So she didn't knock that off the front pages, but she certainly took attention away from it by refocusing everyone's attention on the Yorks. Well, Sarah York was spitting mad when she discovered that what Diana had done. And they fell out in a major way over it. But they kissed and made up back, although they then fell out again before she died. But that's another story. She then decided that this was not enough. And she asked James Hewitt to give an interview to the Daily Express. And she set it up through Alan Frame, who was the deputy editor of the Daily Express. And he got a young staff reporter who, according to him, couldn't write to save her life, called Anna Pasternak, to interview James Hewitt at Diana's behest. Well, poor unfortunate James Hewitt, of course, has been called a cad ever since, because he obliged Diana by giving this interview, which was set up by her, to deny that they had ever been lovers and to confirm that they had only ever been friends. He gives the interview, and of course the press jump on him. How could this beastly army officer chappie be saying that he's a friend of a close friend, not a lover, just a close friend of that? He's trading on the friendship. So James Hewitt, who was mortified by this, as you will understand, most people who really are not that used to publicity are extremely intimidated, and, you know, anything that happens in the public eye is like magnified by 10. So, and your feelings are magnified by 10, and he was mortified by this. And, you know, he's charming, but I mean, he's sufficiently vain, and that it would bother him. But then most of us are sufficiently vain that being called a cad would bother us. I mean, it's a perfectly normal reaction. And he asked Diana to just make an announcement, very subtly, a small statement, confirming that he had done this at her behest. Diana's reaction was to stop speaking to him altogether. Well, we all know how successfully James Hewitt has been able to overcome this reputation, because he's now regarded as one of the greatest cads that ever lived. And, of course, he did, after all of this, and after Anna Pasternak had flirted with him a little bit, he did consent to give her more information, and that book, Princess in Love, got to be written, which, incidentally, to those of you who haven't read it, it's a guinea a minute. I mean, it's not what you'd call great literature, but it's certainly very entertaining. And most of it is absolutely true, and written in the most appalling style, which makes it even more entertaining. Anyway, I did not really propose to spend the rest of my working life writing about Diana or the royal family. However, by this time I was in the process of adopting what became 2 children. And my publisher said, "Oh, you'd be crazy to not do another book on the royal family, because blah, blah, blah," because Diana in private had got so much attention and was a worldwide success, bestseller, and sat on the New York Times bestsellers list for months, etc., etc. So I wrote another book on the marriages of the Queen, her children and her parents. At which point my mother said to me, "My dear, will you please stop writing on the royal family? We'd like whatever little bit of reputation that you have left to be retained." So I agreed with her that I would stop writing on the royal family, which in fact I did. I used to, of course, but having written about Diana, I was now, and also because